在场的朋友们大家下午好欢迎来到我们 ChatGPT 加教育专场我是世界科技的总经理李志伟也是这个本堂的主席因为今天我们的分享是以英文为主，所以我从现在开始也以英文跟大家交流。Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the ChatGPT plus education section. I am Rick Lee from World Scientific Publishing. I'm the general manager of World Scientific Publishing and also the chair of this section. Okay, just now before lunch, we have a very interesting section on AI and life sciences, which is, I find it a very stimulating section. I hope you all enjoyed it. But today, this section is slightly different. It's more focusing on a very different aspect to what we have talked about since yesterday. Actually, we cover a much wider aspect on in the latest AI and ChatGPT or generative AI development. We cover mainly on the education. What is the impact? Is there any disruption in our education system because of the generative AI or ChatGPT, or more specifically ChatGPT? So, without further ado, maybe let me get a first introduction. I think in our industry, actually ChatGPT draw our attention, I would say, from the very beginning of the year. One of the reasons is because there was an article, academic article published by a publisher, with one of the author is ChatGPT. Now that was very, very interesting in the sense, actually create a lot of hoo-ha among our industry. Because academic publishing is actually considered as a gatekeeper in academic research. Our role is to make sure whatever published has to be properly peer-reviewed and authors are answerable to whatever the outcome from that paper. But when ChatGPT is one of the authors, then people start questioning, so what is the role of ChatGPT? If something is wrong, who is going to answer? So of course, at the end of the day, the publisher say there was a mistake. Yeah, but of course, create this is something that we all need to take note. And because of that, actually among our industry across the world, all the publisher, the major publishing houses have to come up with a statement to show what is our stand on this generative AI, this tool, to be published, to be an author. So we also have to come up very quickly with a statement for all the publishers, and World Scientific is one of them. And of course, after we publish this statement, we also get a lot of query from our managing editors of journals and how to deal with the issues for if the author use ChatGPT or other generative AI tools to do the research and publish. How are we going to handle that? So we all come up with some our stand on those. But that is the time, early this year, draw everyone's attention on ChatGPT. And to look further, more wider aspect on this area is actually how does that affect the research, the publication, higher education, and so on. That's the reason today we have this section to mainly focusing on this issue. So today I'm very happy to invite 3 speakers from different parts of the publication and education sector. I have a publisher to join us, and I have talked about what are the issues with, last couple of years we talked about text and data mining, what is the rights, how we deal with the content creator, their own rights. And I have a librarian who understands how all this technology works, to talk about how it can apply in the university setting. And I have an educator and a person who is very familiar with and have a lot of experience in university administrative roles to talk about education as a whole, especially in higher education. So, without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker, Mr. Peter Sobert. Peter Sobert is a publisher, and he is the director of the NUS Press of the National Universities of Singapore. He is also a past president of the Singapore Book Publisher Association. Now, he is also a technopreneur, so he worked in a lot of related areas before, and he started a blog mainly on generative AI last year. So let me welcome Peter to talk about all the issues related to ChatGPT and copyrights.
Thank you very much, Rick. Hello, everyone. I'll try to keep it a little bit lively after lunch. So Rick invited me. We're here learning about all the wonderful uses of AI and the new innovations and improvements and techniques. Yes, in the panel on life sciences just now. I'm here to talk about the problems. Sorry to be the wet blanket. There are three problems that I want to talk about. Clicker. Oh, down button. Three problems: copyright, a little bit then on privacy and liability, which Rick also mentioned just now. So in order to do that, I want to just revisit, you guys know so much better than me, but I want to revisit a little bit some aspects of how the large language models in particular are created, or generative AI models more generally, looking at the training data, looking at the parameters, and looking at the modular character of how they work. Then look at some of the problems. Go through them one by one. So training the large language models, I want to start with BERT. So transformers have been around for a while, but this bidirectional transformer achieved very important and interesting results. And it was trained on about 10 billion tokens. That's a lot of text, right? That's, 7 billion words or so. And the sources were two things: Wikipedia in English, I believe only English Wikipedia, and something called Book Corpus, which was a whole bunch of novels downloaded from a website, something like, like a Webtoons kind of site of amateur novels. About 11,000. It turned out there were a lot of repeats. And it was the reason that the researchers wanted to use Books Corpus, it had been around for a while, was because it had a long continuous text, so that they could see how well their model could handle context, long context of text. Now, this wasn't without some controversy. This Books Corpus had been used already from 2015, 2016. And even in 2016, the authors of these novels said, oh, hey, we didn't actually give you permission to use your text for that, my text for that purpose. Yes, you can download the book free to read it, but I said on my copyright page, you can download it free for your reading pleasure, not for any other purpose. So here Google is using it for another purpose. And Google said, well, it doesn't harm the authors, doesn't hurt them, because we're just using it to improve our email autocomplete. And it's a very different purpose, so it's okay. So the issue has been alive actually since 2016. So we fast forward a few more years, and we see now with GPT-3 a much larger training set, right? If that's BERT, that's the 10 billion. Now we're scaling up to approximately 300 billion tokens being used on a 175 billion parameters model. Books are still quite important part of that. There are two data sets, books 1 and 2, that were about 48 billion tokens out of the 300 billion total. And even the Common Crawl, this web scrape, right? So everyone says the models are trained by reading the internet. But that kind of characterization makes you think it's all reading user-generated content, and it's all reading Reddit and Twitter and so on. When in fact, if you look at how the Common Crawl data set was about a trillion tokens, but they only used 180 billion tokens to train GPT-3, and the way that that was filtered was, well, let's see, I think I have a slide on that. Yeah, the way that was filtered was by training another model to recognize high quality content. So what was the training data for that? So high quality content was content from books, and then low quality content was the content from the web crawl. So that was the training set, and then you compared the crawl to those examples. So you run everything through the classification model: good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. So yeah. So as a publisher, I get a little irritated when I hear, oh, it's trained by reading the internet. In fact, it's trained by reading lots of books. But okay, this was ChatGPT. This is GPT-3. This is 2020. It was a long time ago. Now we're in 2023. Things have changed, right? Now we're talking about, instead of just 300 billion tokens with books, being there, now we're talking about, what, 1.4 trillion, 2 trillion tokens for Llama 2. Surely publisher content can't be part of that. It's got to be just the wilds of the internet. Well, no, in fact, if you look at the Chinchilla paper was quite seminal, right? Where Google DeepMind in London folks said, actually, the returns to scale are not coming from increasing parameters. The returns to scale come from having more data. So this kind of changed the paradigm, right? But so they trained Chinchilla with only 70 billion parameters, much smaller, but on 1.4 trillion tokens. And what were the sources of that text? Well, it turns out that 420 billion tokens were from books, from 4 million books. Now, the British Library contains 14 million books. So where did Google get 4 million books to train the model from? Well, it must be Google Books, right? Which is, when we send our books to Google Books, we didn't know that they were going to use it for this. So, and then also news, 180 billion tokens are from news stories, 1.1 billion news stories. And then the rest comes from web sources, including, importantly, GitHub, right? So GitHub provided about 56 billion tokens of computer code. And then, of course, other people have fine-tuned off of that. So I think the point is that, well, let's just stick with this for a second. The point is that the copyright situation around the copying of all of this material is by no means clear. But what I want you to know first is that, yes, it's trained on the internet, these data sources, but where they come from originally, a lot of it is publisher content and researcher content. Now, what about parameters? Okay, so what are these models? I think this is a question that I'm interested in because it has to do with how they're regulated. Okay, you will all have your different understanding of what the parameters are. But one interesting thing is that the parameters are, you can think of them as a kind of representation of the data they were trained on, right? They're the weights that are adjusted as you feed more text in, as the model learns to predict the missing words. And the weights are all adjusted. And at the end of the day, what is that? So one idea is to say it's an understanding of the world, right? So Ilya Sutskever, chief scientist of OpenAI, will say, because they've learned language, they understand the world. But other people will say, no, it's just a statistical model of language use and of the relationship of words to other words in different contexts. And the difference to this is kind of interesting. So can you say that the parameters, the weights in the model are a kind of software? Or can you say actually that they're a kind of data, that they are a different representation, a translation, if you will, of the training data into a much more compressed, absolutely much more compressed, but abstract representation of the training data? So are the parameters, is it software? Do you have now a software that you can run and reprogram? Or do you have a big set of data that you use to, a set of variables that you use for different purposes? I think there's only one possible answer. It's both, right? It's something in between. I mean, think about it. Can you program a large language model? Once you have it, can you program it? No, right? You can train it more and you can prompt it, but you can't program it in the sense of a classical cause and effect logic-based software. So the third point then, the modular nature of how the models work. I think we really have to think about them as a system. It starts with the data and it goes all the way to the end user. Now, data is created by humans. It's not all copyrighted, but it's created by humans, right? There's weather, but it's not data until somebody decides to record it, right? So it begins with humans, then we choose the data that we train our models on, then we train our foundation model. We get our pre-trained large language model. Now, most of the activity, as far as I can see in the last few years, has, with large language models especially, has been in the adaptation and the fine-tuning. So reinforcement learning with human feedback, various kinds of filtering, various kinds of model, what Stanford calls model patching, modular plugging in the models to each other, like creating a classification model to say this is good, this is bad, and so on. So that's where a lot of the activity is. Then at some point, the companies decide to make it available to the public. Open source in the case of Llama, or proprietary through OpenAI, and so on. A lot of that is through the APIs, so fascinating to have this power on tap for your purposes. And then many businesses now are built on APIs. When Sam Altman was in Singapore the other day, so many of the people speaking at the session and asking questions said, I have started a marketing business based on the OpenAI API. And then you have the end user. So I think it's very important that we always think of this. We can't just think Google, we can't just think OpenAI. We have to think about the whole ecosystem when we think about how these models will be received and used. Okay, let me look at the problems. Copyright. So the first argument of Google that we heard already back in 2016, but we've heard from all of the AI companies, is its fair use. I don't know, do you guys want to get deep into copyright law? The short answer is very uncertain, because the American system of fair use is something that a judge decides based on current examples. So it's very hard to know in advance. It's a good system because it's flexible. You have a new technology. We have these principles to decide whether it's legal or not legal. But it takes a long time, and it takes a court, and there are all kinds of details that can determine what the thing is. So personally, I think even the number one lawyer for stable diffusion now in one of the legal cases in the US, Mark Lemley, a Stanford professor, he says, there's no way the models can be fair use because they reproduce their training data too easily. So how can something which can copy be fair use, right? Because the output is copying exactly the input, at least some of the time. So that's his view. I won't argue with the Stanford professor. Then in Europe, and maybe in Singapore, we say, our models are trained under exceptions. So we have these exceptions which allow us to use content that we have access to. And that's true, but even in the European law and in the Japanese law, there are these guardrails, there are these conditions upon this. And one of the most interesting ones is the commercial, non-commercial distinction. So stable diffusion says, it was a German researcher who built the Leon data set, which we trained the model on, which is now, is stable diffusion. So non-commercial, and we just happen to be commercializing it, right? That's how research is supposed to work. Non-commercial research, commercialization. But when you look at the details, you see that all the computing power of the non-commercial research unit was funded by stable diffusion. And when you look at the staff of stable diffusion, the CTO is also the head of the research group. So these boundaries are a bit fuzzy. So what is the answer? And then, of course, also, one of the things which we publishers have noticed is that even under the European and the Singaporean law, where you have a lot of freedom to copy to train your models, you still must have legal access to what you train. And one of the big data sets, the pile, I'm sure some of you have played around with that data set, it has a lot of stuff that is just pirated content. So it has about almost 200,000 novels, which are illegally copied in the first place. So it's not certain that these models are legal from a copyright perspective. Wow, I mean, to me, that's like, I want to use these models, don't get me wrong, right? I want to use them, I love to use these models. I want to do it in a way that is legal and respects the interests of everyone involved. One of the first things I did was ask when ChatGPT came out, was I asked it to read me some Harry Potter. And so it read me the first paragraph very easily, and it told me helpfully who wrote Harry Potter and when it was published, the first novel. Amazing, right? Fantastic. Then I said, read me the second 2 paragraphs. It said, oh, I am a large language, you've been there, right? I am a large language model. I cannot just read books or read the internet. I'm like, yeah, but you can, right? So next question, okay, read me the first paragraph and the next 3 sentences, next 2 sentences. And that can do that. So what's happening here is that, OpenAI has put a patch on it. It's put a filter. It's comparing the outputs against the training data and saying if they're too close, if they're too similar, don't repeat it. Or I don't know what heuristic they may be using other heuristics to do that. I don't know. So the big argument on, well, I'll skip this because this is a little bit technical on fair use again. What is the purpose? But the short way to look at it is this, I think. If I'm a photographer and my photos are used to train a self-driving car, to say, oh, that's a stop sign, and that's another car. As a photographer, that doesn't hurt me, right? I mean, I'm helping train a model which will save lives. But the problem is now that the models are being used for the same purpose that I had in mind when I took the photograph. They're being used to create art. They're being used to create expression. So many AI companies are saying, oh, you don't need a writer anymore. You can just use ChatGPT. So it's being used to harm the market of the writers. At the Sam Altman talk in Singapore, I met a friend of mine who manages a big government IT company. She said, oh yeah, I just sacked 2 marketing people because we don't need them anymore, because we have the engines. So the models are starting to encroach on the area of the people whose works were copied. Just ask Greg Rutowski. So he's an artist who creates this kind of work, and when people started playing with Stable Diffusion and WALL-E, they wanted to create work like this, because who wouldn't, right? So drama. So it became the most used prompt in the style of Greg Rutowski. And so many people made so many images in the style of Greg Rutowski that if you search for Greg Rutowski, you see all the AI-created images and you don't see his. So he said, that's not right, So this is the copyright problem. It's not so much that it is illegal to train the models, but it's that the models are being used for purposes, the same purposes of which the training data was created. So there's a kind of confusion there. Does that make sense? Do you see that point of view? So how are we going to resolve that? Who knows, right? It's being debated, it's being discussed. There are about 10 court cases in the US where this is all being argued right now. Next question, privacy. So given that huge amount of training data and the fact that much of it is scraped from the internet, we know that there's personally identifiable information in the models. And many people have demonstrated that it's very easy to get personal identifiable information from the large language models. So, but if you do get that, you actually don't know for sure that it was in the training data, because maybe the model just hallucinated it, right? If it wasn't there, it could easily, it knows what an email address looks like, so it could give an email address. It knows what citations look like, so it very easily gives fake citations all the time, right? So we don't even really know, even if we see it out of the model, we don't know if it's in the training data or not. Now, the GDPR and other privacy laws, and by the way, the Chinese laws are even tougher than the European and the American laws. They all require that if there's personal data on a website or anywhere, that you have the right to get it back, to take it out. How are you going to do that for a large language model? how are you going to pull that out of the training? You're going to tell it, okay, you just retrain without these 5 people in it? No, I mean, it costs what, $10 million to train a model. So this is a bit of a problem. How are you going to do it at scale? You can filter, or maybe at the outputs. So you can say, okay, no emails, no. And OpenAI is pretty good. ChatGPT will say, oh, I cannot share personal information. So, but that's filtered on the output. And you guys are super clever. You know how to prompt engineer to get around these, how to jailbreak the models, right? So this is the OpenAI statement, and I believe them I believe this completely, 100%. But let me just tell you the last part. So we fine-tune our models to reject requests for personal information. We've all seen that happen. That's great. And we respond to requests from individuals to delete their personal information from our systems. I love this answer. We respond to requests, meaning, oh, thank you for your request. And then what? I mean, they don't say we delete personal information from our systems upon request. So, yeah, because they can't. I mean, they can't. It's not, the architecture of the system just doesn't work this way. And then liability. Who is responsible for the crazy things the models say? What happens if ChatGPT says, so-and-so is a sexual harasser, has been accused of sexual harassment at his university? Well, you can ask the professor who this happened to. And it wasn't, strangely enough, it wasn't just one model, it was 2. Both Bard and ChatGPT also gave the same answer. Why, I don't know. So, the reporters all called up Google and said, what are you going to do about this? And Google said, we are making steps to ensure that our results are safe. They don't know why it happened. They can't do anything about it. The models, there's no relationship between a large language model's output and truth. And this is the connection with education, right? The large language models are plausible, but they don't speak, there's just no relationship between truth and what they say. The technical term for this is bullshitters, right? It's not that you're lying, it's that you're just talking. We've all had colleagues like that, right? Who are very good at talking, but whether it's true or not is another question. So these are the 3 problems. Who is going to be responsible for what the models say? This is another way of looking at the complex system. I reduced it to 4, right? But we have the pre-trainer, the model publisher, the B2B customer, and the end user. The AI Act in Europe is trying to say, look, the person who trained the model, who created the foundation model, the pre-trained model, must be responsible for the output. But OpenAI and Google are pushing back very hard with the help of the US government. And they're saying, no, only the company who's offering the product, the interface, who's doing whatever special pre-prompting or fine-tuning, only they should be responsible for liable if something goes wrong. And so that fight is going on now in Europe. I don't know what the answer is. Again, China is actually much more extreme, right? China says, you who create the model are responsible for everything, including recording all the prompts that you've received from people. So China has a much stricter idea about that the companies must take responsibility for this, which is quite interesting. So we have 3 different kinds of regulation approaches to this, and whether we'll have 3 different worlds of AI because we have 3 different kinds of regulation remains to be seen. So what should our stance be as educators? Here I'm speaking for publishers and educators. I think we just have to say, hey, this is bigger than just Google or AI or Facebook. This is a big question that we all have to decide together. So don't just say, oh, it's coming, it's a new technology, what can we do? Yes, they're super rich, these companies. They made a lot of money already from these technologies. I'm not sure they're making money now. I mean, you look at the inference costs of ChatGPT and the revenue streams, there may be a mismatch there. But, so we just have to say, no, we have to decide this as a society. There are many other issues I didn't talk about. The bias thing could keep us here all day. But of course, as educators and as publishers, we have to learn about these systems. We have to know how they work. We have to try them. Our students are going to use them if we don't, so of course we have to know. I spent the morning editing text, and let me tell you, GPT-4 is very good assistant to me to edit text. I love it. I used it all morning. So yeah, I guess that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Just hold on a second. Anyone any question for Peter? If no question, I have one question. No, just now, actually, before I look at your slide, I was thinking, I mean, we all know that recently OpenAI have this GTP bot. It's going to crawl the whole internet.
Yeah.
So we know that actually they are all pirated books. As I can tell everyone, any books you want, you can find a copy on the internet, no matter how publisher, how library try to safeguard it. So, with a very smart way of doing prompt engineering, do you think, I don't think anyone have ever done it, you just try, can reproduce a book?
Yeah, I mean, the Mark Lemley paper that I referred to, where he's written it together with some computer scientists, and they're arguing for a new way of training the models. And they worked much harder to reproduce the training data, and they got whole chapters of Harry Potter. Harry Potter's an easy example because there's so many pirate copies, so there are many copies probably in the training data. Of course, they try to dedupe, but it's not perfect. Even in images, even Stable Diffusion, you can get it reproduces its training data less than 1% of the time, less than 0.1% of the time, but we're talking pixel perfect. I mean, pixel perfect, not something that looks like, that's very close to. We're talking pixel by pixel the same. So I think, yeah, it's an important area of research because it's also cyber safety, right? It's cybersecurity. If you can reproduce the training data, what else can you do to manipulate the models? So the people who create the models are quite concerned about this. You raise a very interesting point about the robots. Of course, they want to keep the model fresh, so they want new data. I don't know exactly what the architecture of how that will be used. The publishers have already actually, working through W3C, working through our standards bodies, have already made a standard for saying, please don't copy me for AI purposes. Yeah,
they basically only opt out.
Yeah, because the European law says you must have the ability to opt out for commercial purpose. Yeah, but the piracy problem combined with this,
Okay, thank you, Peter. Anyone, any other question for Peter? Okay, thanks, Peter, again. Okay, next. Now, I'm very happy to have Aaron Day. Aaron has been an academic librarian for over 10 years, and actually he is a very techy person as far as I understand. And he has worked in various areas in the library discovery, research support, and biometrics. And he's currently the lead data services at the Singapore Management University Libraries. And actually, I first heard about Aaron was actually through a blog, which I found very, very interesting. He talked about a lot of all these tools and new ideas in the library setting to discover content, to manipulate content, which I find very useful, even as a publisher. Then we don't do that kind of thing, but I find that now we understand better how the library service the customer, that means the academic and the students. So without further ado, actually another thing I think later we will talk about, actually SMU is going to have a hackathon on ChatGPT end of the month, which I think must be very interesting. Okay, but without further ado, let me have have Aaron to come to give his talk. Thank you.
Hello. I guess the first thing I want to say about the hackathon is I'm not getting very worried after Peter talked about the copyright issues. I hope he doesn't sue us for the hackathon. So, never sue students. So, my area of knowledge and interest is in search, academic search. So for this talk, I'm going to talk about some of the latest advancements that I'm seeing in academic search engines, as well as some of the things that we are doing in SMU to respond to this whole large language models movement. Okay. So this is the standard slide I always show. There's been a lot of advancements in innovation for academic discovery, but I'm going to talk about the hottest thing right now, which is the use of generative AI with search. And technically, the term you see in the literature is augmented retrieval language models, or augmented retrieval generation, right? So this actually uses the power of large language models in terms of their natural language understanding and natural language generation capabilities, and combine this with conventional search. So when we talk about generative AI, nowadays we talk about transformer-based large language models. We're talking about OpenAI's BERT models, GPT models, BERT models, Llama models, and so on. And in search, it's being used in three main areas. First, to improve relevancy ranking. Second, to generate direct answers, as opposed to just showing you links to documents. And thirdly, extraction of information from pages. So for example, you may be looking for papers that are, say, studies on COVID, where the study was done in China and Singapore, right? So these tools are able to actually show you papers where the studies were done in China and Singapore alone. So the first one is already happening, but it's under the hood. So traditionally, search engines actually match documents based on keywords, lexical kind of search. Increasingly, they've been using semantic type of search. As a librarian, I've been told about semantic search for the last decade or two. And my experience in the past is whenever a startup came to me and said there's semantic search, I would be very wary, because the semantic search up to recently has not been very good. I think things have changed since around 2020, around the time where OpenAI started to launch GPT-3. So using embedding-based techniques, right, the results have improved a lot. So in this example, right, I was actually looking for papers that were techniques on finding seminal papers. So how do you find seminal papers? I was a bit lazy, so I went to Google Scholar like most people, and I searched how to find seminal paper. And the results were horrible. I think the top 10 results, maybe only one was relevant. Basically because Google Scholar didn't seem to realize that how to find is actually a phrase. It was like matching how here, find there, in different sentences, and the results were bad. Right? And this is Google Scholar, the master at search. Right? So Google Scholar currently, I believe, is still using mostly lexical kind of keywords-based searching. There's some other techniques, but it's basically still keyword-based. On the right, you can't really see this. This is illicit. They are more well-known for the fact they can generate answers, but they also use the latest embedding-based techniques. Right? So what they do is that they take all the full text, they take all the content from Semantic Scholar, title, abstract, and some of open access full text, they convert it into embeddings, and they do the embedding-based matching, basically semantic search. And the results are way better. Of course, most of the time you can't tell the difference, because most of the time the results are equally good. But once in a while, you'll notice that the latest methods seem to understand your query a lot better. Of course, the other main thing that people are excited about is the ability of large language models to generate direct answers. Right? So the old paradigm of showing 10 blue links, people want to replace it with showing a direct answer. But of course, we know that there are a lot of issues with this. This is a question about finding who won the FIFA World Cup. As you guys know, ChatGPT, even GPT-4, currently cannot answer this question unaided. Basically because its training data set is up to September 2021. Of course, there are other models like Claude 2 and so on, which have newer date limits. But as I think Peter has talked about, it's extremely expensive to train the pre-trained model from scratch. Right? So the lack of currency will always be a problem. Right? So no language model will be able to tell you what is the stock price of Google yesterday? The other problem that I think is even more serious is the fact that there's no way to verify answers. The current language models, they reproduce answers from their training data, but there's no way to actually tell which data sets they are using. I've read research to say that people are trying to do that, but currently all you get is some generated answer, and you have no idea which training set it was actually using to answer the question. So the solution that people have been trying, kind of obvious, is to combine them with search engines, or what we call retrieval. Right? So the idea here is that if you type in a question, it will go to Bing or some retriever, some search engine. It will look up the answer, right? And it will send, say, a sentence with the answer to the generator, like ChatGPT, and then ChatGPT will be prompted to try to answer the question using what it found. So if you use something like Bing Chat, Perplexity, or any of these newer AI-powered systems, they will be able to not only answer the question, but tell you where they got the answer from. Right, so you can see a little one there pointing to the URL. This is Perplexity, which is similar to Bing Chat. This one is even more obvious. It even tells you which sentences and which URL it found, and you will actually use this to answer the question. So this is extremely transparent. You can see the 1, 2, 3, the pages where it found the answer, the sentences it used to generate the answer. Right? So this solves the problem of currency. You can ask it something that happened yesterday, as long as you can find the web page, and you can even tell which web page it got the answer from. And of course, I've been talking about general web, right? Of course, when there's Google Scholar. So similarly, right, people have been talking about ChatGPT, Bing Chat, but I'm not sure how many people are aware that there's an academic version of it going on since 2020. Right, so these are just some that have been emerging. Elicit, Site, SciSpace, and so on. And of course, recently, I think last week, or is it this week? Last week, the commercial search engines are coming in. So Scopus, Dimensions, even Web of Science, they talked to Nature, and they were saying that they are going to introduce similar search engines. Right? So basically, all of them will give you a direct answer when you search, right? Using whatever it found in the title and abstract of Scopus, and I think the full text of Dimensions. But let's talk about Elicit. This, as far as I can tell, is the first academic search engine that actually worked with OpenAI. They were early OpenAI partner. I think around late 2021, early 2022, they contacted me to actually try this out. So the first thing it does, as I mentioned before, is that it produces an answer, it generates an answer based on the first 4 papers it found, right? So this is something that you can use. How good is it? It depends. Sometimes it picks up papers that I don't think are very relevant or barely relevant. Other times it can be pretty good. But the one thing you can be sure of is that it does not hallucinate papers, because it's literally a real paper that was found, right? If you use even GPT-4, right now, I was seeing a paper that suggested that it was still hallucinating about 20% of references, right? But with this, it will never hallucinate the paper. The paper is real. Let me go on. The other thing that I find probably even more useful is its ability to extract information, right? So in this case, you can see that it's actually generating columns of data, like for example, the outcome that's measured, the detailed study design, and you can even create your own columns. So for example, I created a column saying, what was the data set used? Right, so this is extremely useful if you're looking for specific answers. I work with a lot of grad students, and they often have to generate tables of data like this to show to their supervisor. So this can actually do it. And the cool thing is, even though this is not 100% accurate, I don't think there's any study yet on how accurate this is, kind of working on this, but the startup founders told me it's around 70% accurate currently. And the cool thing is you don't even have to trust this. If you click on any of these pieces of information, they will send you to the text that is highlighted that was used to generate the information. So you don't even have to take this on trust. You can actually see which sentences it thought justified these pieces of information. And right now, a lot of people are trying this, right? Chat with chat with PDF services. You load up the PDF, and then you can ask questions. So Illicit has this as well. These are mostly open access papers only. Right? Here, for example, you can see the parts that have been highlighted that answers the question. Of course, the other thing is that some people do not like to use this type of search engines. They are still used to using ChatGPT. So if you pay for ChatGPT Plus, 20 USD a month, you can actually use plugins. And there are many plugins that basically do the same thing. This is an example using something called Scholar AI. Okay, what it does is that if you ask any question, and ChatGPT thinks that it's a scholarly literature question, it will look up scholarly papers. They are using Semantic Scholar and OpenAlex, right? And it will do the same thing, basically find relevant papers and ask ChatGPT to answer based on what it found. This is you can see in the background what's actually happening. It actually found these 4 papers with abstracts and so on, and ChatGPT is asked to answer the question using this information. So again, it will not hallucinate. It will always come up with a real paper. This is another one, Cite AI. So Cite AI, they are more famous for doing citation sentiment analysis. That means they can tell you, is this citation a positive citation or a negative citation? More recently, they started to do this Cite Assistant, which works exactly the same way. You type in a question, it tries to generate citations based on its database, and you can mouse over each of the citations to see the sentence that was used to generate the question. The answer. The other thing that they have done that is kind of unique is that they allow you to control what type of citations appear. Right? So you can say you want the evidence to come from the abstracts only, from the citation statement, that means the sentence with the citations. You can say what journals you want the answers to come from. You can say the dashboard. So the dashboard is basically a list of papers. So for example, what I've done is that I've uploaded 1,000 SMU papers, the title and abstract, and then it's now trying to answer based on only SMU papers, and so on and so forth, right? We are still very early in the days of generative AI and search. In fact, this idea of using a search engine to answer questions directly is not new. As far back as 2012, Google was already answering questions like, how old is somebody? They were using Google Knowledge Graph, right? And even after that, you can sometimes even see answers generated where the answers come from a web page. So here I actually asked, how can you find book a room in SMU libraries? It actually generates an answer, a sentence that it got it from our web page. This is called the feature snippet feature. Right? So this is actually not new. It's just that this is rare. It only appears when the Google is very sure that this is the answer. Right? But of course, so this is, I won't go through the rest, but essentially there are all these little academic search engines. They are basically doing more or less what I've shown for Illicit. So they are basically following the lead of Illicit. And of course, Google is now trying to experiment further with generative AI. So they are now trying to generate answers in more cases. Right? So this is something that they are trying to figure out the trade-off between being helpful and being accurate. So far I've talked about these tools like they are like the solution to everything. But actually, there are a couple of issues. Firstly, they are very, very new. There isn't much research on them. I'll talk about some of the research later. But essentially, we're not sure how accurate or reliable they are. Yeah. Secondly, most of these tools are all based on open access full text. In terms of metadata, there's not so much of a problem because these days scholarly metadata is available through Crossref and various other sources. So the problem is more of full text, right? So right now these tools are basically showing full text from open access papers. So this is an early research about the impact of adding evidence, right? So the first row is about GPT 3.5. They asked it about 200 questions and it got like most of them wrong. It's about 60% accurate, right? And they even divided into why it got it wrong. So comprehension would be like, it didn't even understand the question, right? Factualness is obviously the most obvious one. It doesn't have the right fact. So if you ask it, it will tell you the wrong fact, right? Inference is more of reasoning. So they altered it by giving it the evidence, that means the correct answer. So obviously, once they gave it the correct answer, assuming it's the correct answer, its accuracy rate goes up to 85%, right? Which is better than even GPT-4 alone, right? But of course, this is the ideal case, right? I tell ChatGPT, this is the fact, and then it answers. Obviously, it gets it mostly right. The main problem, of course, is the search engine may not get the right evidence. This is the only paper I know so far that actually did a very, very rigorous study about these 4 AI-based search engines that generate answers. Of these 4, one of them is dead already. There are now 3. Okay? So what they did was that they actually measured the accuracy of citations in 2 ways. Okay? The main problem, of course, is that these tools, right, they will always cite real papers, but the sentence that it supports may not be correct, right? So the first thing they did is they calculated something called citation recall. They looked at all the generated statements and they checked, is there at least one citation that supports the generated sentence? And they call it citation recall. So in the first example, you can see that the 3 generated statements, each of them have at least one valid citation. Therefore, the citation recall is 3 out of 3 or 100%. The other thing they did was to look at the citations itself, right? So in the first example, there are 8 citations, but only 3 of them actually supported the sentence, right? So you get like a precision of 37.5. The abstract of the paper was very scary. It said that on average, about 50% of the generated sentences are fully supported. That means you looked at the answers, half of the sentences actually didn't have valid citations, right? On the other hand, if you looked at the citations at the citation level, only 75% were actually valid. Okay, but I think this was a bit trying to get attention because it's the average of the 4. If you look at the best ones, it's not so bad. 68% of the generated sentences are fully supported by citations, the best one, and almost 9 out of 10 of citations actually support the associated sentence. Let me talk a little bit more. So this one actually shows you how the reliability varies depending on the type of question. So you look at the bottom right. If the answer is inside the paragraph or is answered inside the list, the accuracy rate is a lot higher, right? If it's inside a table, it's lower, right? For obvious reasons. The other problem, of course, is that sometimes, right, the question is so hard that there is no web page that has the answer, right? So there's this thing called All Souls. So All Souls is supposedly an Oxford entry exam. And it's supposed to be the hardest entry exam in the world. Right? There's no web page that usually has the answer. So for that, you can see obviously most of the sentences are not supported by valid citations, right? This one is the citation precision. So this actually measures essentially whether the citations are valid, whether they support the sentences. This one you can see that Bing check is almost 90%. There's a reason for that, because during the time of the study, it was the only one with GPT-4. The rest had like ChatGPT 3.5, right? The funny thing is that when you look at this, right, the Bing is not the best, even though it's using GPT-4, because this one has to do with how well can you find the answer. So you could have the best GPT-4 in the world, the best language model in the world, but your search engine fails to find good relevant evidence, you will not do well, right? The most interesting part of the study wasn't even that. They actually asked people to rate the answers, right? It was a Likert scale, 1 to 5. So they were asked to rate how fluent the answer is and how useful the answer was perceived to be. The main problem is that there's a negative correlation between citation recall precision and fluency and perceived utility, which means that the answers that people thought were the most fluent, that they thought that was the most useful, actually had the worst citations, right? So this is actually very scary when you think about it. I think newer research is coming out to also say roughly the same thing, that the fluency or the comprehensiveness of the answer seems to make people think the answer is correct. So the answer, why is there a negative correlation, is kind of obvious when you think about it. So in terms of fluency, say the generator finds an answer, right, a sentence with the answer. If it tries to paraphrase, it will become fluent. The more you paraphrase, the more fluent it is. But the more you paraphrase, the more likely you're going to paraphrase wrong. Right? So there's a negative correlation here. To the extent that there are some search engines, right, that don't paraphrase at all. They figure out this sentence is likely the answer, they just give you the sentence. Right? The other one is even more serious, perceived usefulness. Right? So assume that I ask you a question that you can't find a good answer to. Right? So what is it going to do? Right? If it decides to say, okay, I will try to answer the question, right? And then the answer will be perceived to be useful because I answered the question, but the citation doesn't actually support it. Or you could be a search engine that decides, let me follow the citation. My sentence will be supported by this sentence. But then the answer doesn't seem to help with the question. And then it's marked down. Right? It doesn't seem to, despite the prompts telling you to say, I don't know, it still tries to answer a lot of the time. The other part that people have been working on is to use large language models to extract information from papers, creating some sort of knowledge graph. And this is being used in systematic reviews right now, I believe. So they're doing stuff like extracting all these papers, all the correlations between different variables, right? Do meta-analysis, right? So there are all these tools out there that are using language models to extract and see what type of variables correlate with which type of variables. Yeah. So one of the things as a librarian is that I'm not really into copyright, so I'm not going to talk about that. I'm into open access. So for a long time when we talk about open access, we always talk about for humans to read. Right? Now machines to read becomes important. So I was doing this example in Bing Chat I was playing around earlier this year, and I asked it like a certain question like, what type of data sets do I use for certain topics? Please answer from smu.edu.sg, right, our university domain. And the interesting thing is the answer was very good. And when I looked at the source, it was actually our institutional repository where we put out our open access papers. Right? And CORE, which is Connecting Repositories in the UK, they have actually harvested basically all the open access papers on all the repositories and all the journals, right? Because UK also has a fairly permissive copyright law. And they actually came up with this Core GPT, which is exactly the same idea, trying to answer questions using all the open access full text. And of course, chatbots, definitely coming. I was not very impressed with the chatbots that we have now, but I was very impressed with Bing Chat. It acts like a librarian, it's helpful. The main problem right now, of course, when we had tried this was that I asked, do you have access to this book? Right? Before that, I was talking about I'm from SMU, blah, blah, blah. Right? It says that there's no such book, the library doesn't have it, basically because we did not index our catalog records in Bing. If you try it in Google Bard, it does. It says you have it because it is indexed. Right? So this shows the importance of indexing your material you want people to find, even more than search engines. Right? And it's very helpful. See, even if it says that it doesn't have it, doesn't seem to have it, it will suggest ways to do it, suggest SMU libraries to buy the book, and so on and so forth. Right? Yeah, when I show this to librarians, they all get very scared. Yeah. Of course, publishers have been thinking about this. So this is more of from Scholarly Kitchen. So these are mostly, I think, journal publishers. And they've been discussing about new revenue models, right? Whether to create their own language models, to cooperate, to sell, and so on. Right? And of course, the one that I'm thinking about is Google Scholar, because everybody knows they have the most amount of full text out there. Basically, their bots are allowed to index behind paywalls. So if they ever decide to use their full text to do this generative AI kind of thing, it'll be amazing. You can ask any question and it will tell you the answer in some full text forms. Of course, there are a lot of issues which Peter already talked about. So, yeah. So there are a lot of implications. I can talk about it for hours. So again, as Peter mentioned, we should be aware of the weaknesses of generative AI. Students, faculty are coming to librarians asking me, how can I do this? And of course, fake news is being used to generate a lot of fake news, and the long-term effects on the use of such technology. So our writing center is very worried about this, because if the system can write as well as you can write, then people don't want to spend time learning how to write. But of course, writing helps you think. That's why I blog a lot. So the fear is that if everybody uses this sort of system to find answers, and these sort of systems are based on knowledge that's on the web, who's going to generate information for this system to learn? Right? And of course, reference work, this for librarians. As I said, very scary. I've been shadowing it by asking some questions I get. And it's kind of amazing. Because it's asking like, so as a librarian, you get chat questions, right, online, and it can be all sorts of topics, and nobody's an expert in all areas of academia, right? But this thing can basically read any web page in like 10 seconds and pull out the answer quickly, right? So it's a bit scary, and sometimes it's kind of ironic when I see the answer, I think great answer, then I looked at the citation. Citation is an FAQ I wrote like 5 years ago, but I forgot about it, right? So, and of course other things are, so the whole thing about open access, right? So right now libraries are thinking about paying to make papers open access. So there are things called transformative agreements and various other things that we librarians do to make things open access. So the question is the value of open access greater now? Right? If your paper is open access, these tools can find it and cite it. So does it lead to an open access citation advantage beyond the usual? Right? Let me just end. And of course, what has SMU been doing, or SMU libraries have been doing? Of course, the first thing is to try to educate. So I've been like watching this space for a while, even before ChatGPT. I got interested around 2020 for GPT-3, when GPT-3 was launched. And basically we do all these newsletters covering some of the things that I've talked about. And then we are getting emails, we're getting thank yous, and we are getting basically people asking me very difficult questions that I don't have the answer to yet. We have been invited to actually take part in this module about the use of AI, responsible use of AI, and the library is involved in the part of the module about thoughtful use of AI tools for learning and growth. Right? A lot of this is more of a philosophy question, but it still helps to actually know the technicals of how these tools work. And of course, as Rick mentioned, we are doing this hackathon, which is 2 weeks from now. The response is overwhelming. We actually closed because we have too many teams. And we are hoping for students to come up with ideas to improve research as well as library experience. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. First of all, anyone any question for Aaron? Oh, please.
Okay.
So thank you, Mr. Tay, for your presentation. It was really impressive. Regarding user education, I believe all people in this hall are aware of this problem and are striving to educate themselves. But for most users, they just want to open the box and use the tool directly. And I wonder if there's a solution that implicitly educates the users or educate them in the process of them using the tool. So I came up with an idea just now, and it's not far from maturity, and I want to share with you, and I wonder what you think of it. So regarding, for example, fake news and all those, so there are contradictions on online search results, and they're definitely going to be indexed. I wonder if we can train the AI or Bing Chat or whatever to offer an alternative opinion that kind of leave the space for the user to determine the efficiency or effect of the answers. Yeah, that's my question. A long one. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is a very difficult question. Like, what is the truth, right? Even two reasonable humans might disagree on what is the truth. So I was reading OpenAI and one of the earlier papers where they talked about WebGPT. So WebGPT is similar to what the current systems are doing. It searches, finds a paper, and then cites. And one of the interesting things that actually struck me when I read the paper was there's a footnote where they start to discuss about which websites are credible. And they went like, we are not qualified to decide which websites are credible. And as a librarian, I was laughing because librarians, they teach information literacy, and they're supposed to teach users on how to decide which web pages are relevant and credible. And I personally, I don't teach that, but I personally find the whole thing kind of is subjective, right? So the idea that you can train a machine to tell you which is likely to be correct or which is likely to be reasonable is kind of tricky because who decides what is credible, right? So if the US, you're Republican, you decide certain web pages are more relevant. If you're Democrat, you decide which ones are not. So there doesn't seem to be a solution out there where one AI tells you the truth. It could be that there are multiple AIs, or you can choose to believe in this AI rather than the other AI. Yeah.
Perfectly right, and I do believe that you know, making AI to offer you one answer isn't a solution. It has to give you the space and opportunity to think of other possibilities, and I think that's what I'm believing. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Because I kind of, yeah, so multiple opinions might be good, yes.
Anyone, any other question? Before, then I have one question. Because Aaron always give me the impression it's not a typical librarian that I know of. Because my wife was trained as a librarian, totally don't know anything about what we are talking about. So I want to ask you, what do you think of the impact of these new tools, new generative AI era affect the next generation of librarians?
Yeah, this is the part that whenever I give talks to the librarians, they get very scared. I think one of the things is that, at least for things like Bing Chat and all that, it actually means that librarians have to be more specialized. Right? So if I ask any general question and the answer can be found from a web page, basically you're in trouble. If your specialty is just Googling quickly and looking at the answer, that one is no longer needed, because these systems can Google faster than you and read it. But I believe I still have capabilities that like Bing Chat couldn't do. So for fun, I write a blog post and I'll think of some idea, I want to write a blog post. And I'll try to ask these systems to write it. Right? They still can't because they don't have my ideas. Of course, the funniest thing is the moment I write a blog post, it gets indexed. The next moment it knows those answers that I gave. Right? But either way, it seems to me that librarians have to have deep specialized knowledge that isn't easily summarizable from the web page. Right? Because a lot of people, they think librarian job is just to Google and read the web page. Right? But I guess chatbots are basically saying you no longer need that. Yeah, so that's one thing that I think is that going to happen. You need deep specialized knowledge. Maybe not just librarians. I think for any job and any career, if your knowledge can be found just by Googling, you're in trouble. Yeah, and part of me wondering is like, should I blog so much because I'm giving Bing Chat all the answers, all my ideas? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Aaron again. Okay, our next speaker, actually Professor Lai Choi Hing. He is an emeritus professor of physics and president's advisor of the Tianjin University NUS Joint Institution, Fuzhou, China. Now, Prof. Lai always gives me the impression he is something like a walking encyclopedia. The way I put it this way, because whenever we have problem, we will approach him. He may not give us the answer directly, but at least he will point us to the right direction to get the answers. So other than he is doing as a professor, but he's have a lot of experience in the administrative work. Among the academic administrative responsibility, he was the head of the Department of Computational Science and the Department of Physics, and the Dean of Faculty of Science, Vice Provost of NUS, and Executive Vice President of the Yale NUS College. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Lai to present his understanding or disruption of education.
This also work, right? Okay, thank you very much. Let me say, well, the very first slide is already wrong. All right? One of my professors used to say that you are never ready for a presentation until the moment you step onto the podium. Looking at this presentation slides this morning, then I realized that I should actually start off with bullet point number 3. I'm neither an AI researcher nor educationist. I'm an educator, and there's a lot of difference between an educationist and an educator. And neither have I extensive experience, whether in the form of experimentation or exploration, with ChatGPT, all right? And precisely because of that, then we go back into the first declaration that says that nothing in this presentation is actually original. All right. To some extent, much of this is my digestion of all the information that's already available about ChatGPT in education. And ChatGPT did not write this presentation, right? And after I have written down this sentence and I thought a little bit more about it, it could just as well have been generated by ChatGPT, right? Well, then why am I standing in front of you right now? Okay. Well, I think that one of the hope is that by agreeing to this public humiliation of my lack of knowledge, I hope that we could, in principle, stir up some thoughts to stimulate some discussions and the process, the pros and cons of ChatGPT, or for that matter, generative AI at this time and era, to figure out, more importantly, how we can actually deal with technological developments in education in general. Well, there's been quite a bit of concern about, the appearance of ChatGPT or other forms of generative AI, both within the general public as well as in the education community. Indeed, even the professionals are worried about the uncertain future of ChatGPT. And more generally, artificial intelligence could bring about. All right, and we have read about the news about, Geoffrey Hinton, who is considered by many as the godfather of AI, left Google over the concerns of misinformation. And he thinks that the dangers of chatbots are quite scary, and that the technology could be exploited by bad actors. Now, this sentence, however, hits right at the heart of new technologies in general. Right? Their use could be a two-sided sword that cuts both ways. The uncertainty has prompted many to proclaim the appearance of ChatGPT as the Oppenheimer moment, right? After the atomic bombs during the Second World War days, and even the director of the recent movie Oppenheimer, if you haven't seen it, you should. Okay, this year indeed emphasized the need to be accountable for the tools that we have and the tools that we use in our daily lives. Well, more specifically, what is actually worrying the educational community? Right? This summarizes one of the most feared possibilities of using ChatGPT. Well, Sam Bowman, an AI researcher at NYU, New York University, actually in an interview proclaimed that, well, we built it, we train it, but we don't know what it's doing. This is fairly characteristic of many of the ongoing AI research, and that is also one of the reasons why I'm actually interested in asking the question, are there physical principles underlying all these machine learning processes? Okay, I think it's probably, I have to be very careful here, AI researchers around this, it is probably fair to say that, with what I have come to know about is that when a particular, say for example, artificial neural network being built for machine learning, only those that are successful in accomplishing certain tasks and accomplishing well are being announced. Those that didn't work, you and I wouldn't hear anything about them. So there is actually a danger, right? And all tools based on modern and new technologies obviously has inherently certain uncertainties about what it is actually doing for you. And ChatGPT obviously is not an exception. Well, so I will probably dance around a couple of these questions, particularly referring ChatGPT in education, I would like to say maybe just list out a couple of concerns and potential threats that we perceive in the educational arena. And more importantly, I think that we will have to shift our focus into how we actually use emerging technologies in education in general. Right? The blame shouldn't actually be on ChatGPT itself at the moment. And I would like to think that with every time we have seen technology appearing on the scene, there's opportunities that we can actually adopt, and use in our educational activities. Generative AI is no exception. And finally, I think that, with all these technologies appearing before us, there's also the possibility of looking forward, innovating in adapting and adopting the new technologies and in the form of various educational reforms, right? Things have changed tremendously even during my own lifetime. Right? As a student, I grew up reading handwritten notes by professors, okay, reading textbooks that were few at that time, okay, graduating from underlining with pencils to highlighters, different colored pencils, etc., writing in the margins of books, etc. People don't do that anymore, okay? Whiteboard appearance, presentation slides, etc., have actually become very much part of our life as an educator. So maybe we can take a look and say, well, maybe this is a time for us to look for some of these possibilities. One major thing that immediately came into, in particular, the physics education scene, since I'm a physicist, I have been more sensitive to some of the comments coming from the physics community. This is from a journal, American Journal of Physics, fairly recently, in August, just not too long ago. Right? It says, it suddenly becomes possible for students to recruit the assistance of a sophisticated AI language model with only a computer and an internet connection. In fact, the author went on to conclude that many of our students did just that, prompting questions about academic integrity and the use of AI in the classroom. Right? That's probably the problem. Well, this is indeed a valid concern, but I think putting the blame entirely on ChatGPT is not necessarily fair. The truth is, the learning attitudes of students today have changed. Education is often considered as nothing more than just completing a course or a degree program. Knowledge is no longer looked upon as cumulative or being built up, and the fashionable phrase is just in time. I will talk a little bit more about that, the appearance of ChatGPT on, but I would like to say that ChatGPT is not the first time we encounter these kinds of academic integrity problems. Well, we mentioned a little bit about, student writing using ChatGPT these days. All right, my own initial exploration with ChatGPT, with particular concern about plagiarism, is that the existing anti-plagiarism software, in my opinion, could easily filter or detect plagiarized pieces of writing, if not individually, but in a class of, say, 50, 60 essays being submitted. If all of them were written by ChatGPT, our anti-plagiarism software existing right now will detect quite a bit of similarities and repetitions among them. Simply because ChatGPT has only so many ways of composing the same thing on the same topic here. Right? Furthermore, in my experience now, the perfectly grammatical and perhaps even artistic composition already raises an alarm. Well, the potential use of ChatGPT covers an enormous range, right? For the writing-intensive disciplines, but perhaps less so in the sciences. Automated generation of writing, obviously, is of concern to many disciplines that are writing-intensive, for example. Getting a summary of background research in an area that the student or researcher is embarking on, right? Again, yes, that is a net effect, but not necessarily a negative one, okay, at this point in time. Through ChatGPT, it is also possible to generate detailed feedback on human written texts. In other words, there have always been this communication or opinion that maybe the students should read each other's work before those works are being read by the professor or the teacher. Well, now you have one additional alternative, possibly having a background and an exposure simply because of data used to train them, than the professor, right? Possibly with the exception of sort of new results, immediate, urgent, generated results. And when presented with writing a computer code is fairly obvious, right? You can, there are only so many computer languages that are out there, but they are of very restricted and limited and rigid structures, so easily that can be gotten right. And to me, having spent quite a bit of my professional career in computational science, I'm not sure I'm against that. Somebody else writing the code for me, okay? And when presented with a specific problem, ChatGPT could also provide us with a solution. I say could, not necessarily the optimal, not necessarily the correct, not necessarily the most argued and balanced answer, solution to the problem. Okay, so if I were to say, if I'm only looking at some of these items or potential uses of ChatGPT in the life of a student or an educator, not all bad, okay? Now, obviously, there are challenges, not all things, okay? Oops, I'm sorry. There are challenges related to the use of ChatGPT in these concepts. First and foremost, wrong or incorrect sources could contribute to significant misinformation. Now, because ChatGPT actually learns or searches for available resources on a particular topic or problem, it is conceivable that it might take the most popular or most frequently presented information as definitive. And the sources that ChatGPT rely on to work are usually not in the scientific way of speaking filtered or validated for accuracy. And a rumor, for example, that are spreading extensively in social media could very well be taken as gospel truth and presented as an answer to a question. Again, this is not specific to ChatGPT. We humans too will have to exercise judgment on all the information that we access. Nevertheless, this is a serious concern. Another challenge is the built-in bias or prejudice that could exist in the sources that ChatGPT access. This has been raised earlier on by the two speakers. Not necessarily all sides of view, but possibly one dominates, and the reader is not necessarily given the opportunity to actually decide what is reasonable. Well, this could undermine the use of value of the use of ChatGPT, and detection of such bias and prejudice is not even easy with us humans, right? Much less with a machine. More philosophically, the use of AI in general is the question of integrity and ethics, and this is very common commonly debated in the community of AI in general. Other than resonating with this concern, I really have very little or nothing at all to say anything further. Finally, there is also the question of equity and access, also raised by the previous speakers already, all right? And because ChatGPT is a natural language processing and has a natural language processing ancestry, it is questionable if the same framework can be extended to, say, languages that have less widespread use. An internet connection is requisite here, and it could also mean that the less privileged areas or nations in the world will not have access to this educational technology. This is going to be a very tricky. All right, so let us now look at, say, how have the education been playing a role in the world of education. If you look at ChatGPT as a new, possibly educational technology, it is probably reasonable to ask how this is different from what we have already and are using currently. Well, Google search in particular comes to mind. All information or knowledge we need is in the cloud or internet, the students would tell us. It's what most people think, and we search for the internet for key influences on the internet, the latest Korean pop groups, or topics like blockchain investment, symmetries in physics, latest vaccine developments and medical treatment, the history of Qing dynasty, or the archaeological digs in Egypt, etc., etc. Right? This is solidly established in all aspects of education, and we have taken it for granted. ChatGPT is but a new kid on the block, but it's already getting the attention of IT giants like Wolfram Research, in particular, whose alpha platform is touting computational intelligence with plugins with the GPT engine. Well, I specifically highlighted Wolfram because I first met Stephen Wolfram when he was 19 in Copenhagen. So he has come a long way. Now, how does Google search and ChatGPT compare, especially within the user's perspective? Well, there is, oops, wrong direction. All right, there is a fairly recent study, right, just this month or so, of trying to find out what's the difference between Google search and ChatGPT use. This is a controlled survey dividing groups of people. And the general conclusion is that ChatGPT generally spends less time, but with the caveat that, the overall task performance is not necessarily seen to be better, significantly better. And ChatGPT uses also across different educational levels things that ChatGPT excels in answering straightforward questions and providing general solutions, not very specific solutions, but falls short in fact-checking tasks. ChatGPT's responses also, for some reason, perceive as having higher information quality. And ChatGPT users often report better user experiences, useful, enjoyable, satisfying. Okay. Now, in many ways, all these observations or results are not necessarily surprising. Not at all. For that matter, the later 2 points about it being seen as higher information quality, could it be just the language, right? Instead of having to go to searches. And the difference, obviously, between Google search, at least from our working experience, both as an educator and a researcher, is that I have to do a lot of filtering and digesting. But as Aaron has emphasized, the prerequisite obviously is also a fairly solid foundation in that particular discipline that you're looking at. Okay, and experience over the years help as in practicing the art, and that's also the reason why I have a little head start with my graduate students. They always take a little bit longer to actually get to the crux of the matter, whereas I could do that much easily and faster. Okay, so summary is that the key difference between ChatGPT and the search engine is that search engines typically do not retain an evolving history of an answer, but returns a list of discrete links to resources based on the ranking of specific search terms. Fair enough. That we already know for a long time. Okay? ChatGPT, however, offers one additional advantage in the sense that it offers follow-up questions that can develop and expand answers and respond to challenges posed by the questioner. It doesn't end in one stop. It can, in principle, be made to continue. In other words, the results obtained from the search engines requires further human scrutiny and filtering before the user can get a broad picture, basically. Right? Okay, and I think that the next point, obviously, is that, as educators, what do? Do we leave it to AI to decide for us how AI should be used or, dance around in the educational setting? The point is that just like technologies that we are taking for granted today, there's no way out of here. They're not going away anytime soon. So one of the great American terms that I learned from my days in US, damn if you do, damn if you don't, but here, damned if we don't, right? Well, we need to take the technology in tow and massage it into some useful tools for us to do our job. And this will take efforts, lots of them as a matter of fact, but I don't think that we have any choice here. In a recent EduCourse quick poll, recently, EduCourse is a not-for-profit association that focuses on use of IT in higher education. And one of their quick polls pointed out that, well, look at it in the bright side. ChatGPT actually can be used in quite a number of ways. One, they call dreaming, helping you think. This aspect includes brainstorming, getting unstuck, summary and synthesis of complex content, research and analysis, asking questions, and learning in the process. There's also take some drudgery in your working life out, lightening your load, basically using the technology in sending communications, drafting administrative documents or materials or report, reviewing and proofreading materials, grant, proposal, or contract writing, say, for example. And thirdly, design and building your content, like creating presentations and slides. Not this one, though. And other content, creating course materials, exam syllabi, editing and creating images and video, suggesting prompts and materials for trainings and workshops. Some of this could be useful. Development and advancing your work, drafting department and institution policies, developing departmental institutional strategic plans, creating detailed project plans, or offering advanced scripting and coding. Well, after reading this, I have an immediate feeling. This seems to point to the fact that ChatGPT in principle can make my life easier. Does not necessarily make me a better teacher or an educator. Okay? So, yeah, well, maybe that is just one aspect of it. Well, I think that some of them we can look into what happened in those cases where people actually have used ChatGPT in the educational context, teaching with them. All right. One of them says that ChatGPT appears to perform well for structured tasks, but struggle with nuanced tasks. Very specific, but once you sort of make it a little bit less straightforward and obvious, ChatGPT could be stuck. Well, I can tell you two examples. One, apparently a journalist ask the ChatGPT and say, what are the three of the most remarkable pieces written by the guy, Clive Thompson? And he found that, continuing the discussion, ChatGPT invariably gets everything wrong. So he wrote a piece that says, you know nothing about my work, ChatGPT. Journalism in principle, right? I mean, it is ambiguous. What do you mean by most outstanding pieces? Most read, most commented, most criticized in many ways. And that also has something to do with the currency, immediacy of some of these pieces. Another piece of thing that I have read is from two physics researchers, teachers, that asked ChatGPT the following question. A teddy bear is thrown into the air. What is the acceleration on the teddy bear at its highest point? Okay. Physicists, the answer probably comes, fairly immediately. Right? And unfortunately, I don't think that the two authors actually were very happy with the answers. And the paper is actually called ChatGPT and the Frustrated Socrates. Well, and the conclusion from these two investigators, as a matter of fact, were to say that, at least at this point in time, ChatGPT is not yet qualified as good enough to be used for cheating tool or as a tutor in physics. Well, since we brought up Socrates, one additional advantage of having ChatGPT is that actually you can actually do something through chatbots, say, for example, right, a dialogue, that of learning through questions from the users and responses from ChatGPT, thereby in the process stimulating further follow-up questions through a sustained dialogue, one question after another, depending on how the responses are. This, in the educational context, would be interactive learning, right? Or the good old Socratic dialogue. This would, and strategic design and perhaps also the guidance of a teacher could possibly make this a very constructive and beneficial educational format. So, yeah, not always correct. You could, in principle, to the dialogue, do further filtering and argue the correctness of some of these answers. Well, confronted with this challenging technology, let me do a little bit of advertisement on my research interests, all right, I would like to think, at least in my approach to machine learning and the physical principles underlying them, is that the system is actually driven by the training towards the age of chaos, okay? And the age of chaos, according to chaos theory, is simply the transition zone of bounded stability and engenders a constant dynamic interplay between order and disorder. The simple reason for this particular zone being so important is that stability, order is not interesting. After a while, you get tired. We don't want chaos either, right? Because we don't know how to handle it. But somewhere between these two, okay, you are no longer having that regularity that you're so accustomed to, and yet any small changes could lead to dramatic changes in what we do and how we behave. So, and I'm actually surprised that even in the early 2000s, this line of thinking, right, is already in the community of the psychologists and in the context of how creativity flourishes and how educational system could be looked upon as a complex adaptive system where the system actually reaps the greatest benefit from the edge of chaos, the zone between order and chaos. So, well, I'm an optimist, and I do not think that the rise of AI in general and the appearance of ChatGPT in particular as the Oppenheimer moment, we can still make impactful changes to education if only we could face up to the challenges and make the new technology work for us rather than decide how we go about doing our education work. Right, thank you very much.
Okay, anyone, any questions? Then I have one question. Okay, always, I still remember maybe a couple of years ago when Singapore government saying that primary school students need to start learn coding. Now, one of the problem I heard is how to teach the teacher so that they can teach the kids to do coding. So in such a fast evolving era of generative AI, what can we do to the teachers so that they can know how to tackle this issue?
Well, I think this push for learning coding in schools actually came about from the by now not so fashionable notion of computational thinking in addition to critical thinking. Now, computational thinking actually came about in the 80s, right, by computer scientists. In the 80s, the computers enrollment in the United States is all-time low. So we've got to find a way of sort of stimulating and encouraging students to go into computer science. And this lady who was at one time, who was a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University, a chair of that, and then later on she went on to Microsoft, vice president for research, created this term called computational thinking. Right? To me, nothing in computational thinking is not in scientific thinking. Okay, verifying facts, decomposition of problems into smaller pieces, you handle them each at a time, and then before you tackle the bigger problems. And of course, the reusable code is do not reinvent the wheel, etc. Now, to me, yes, computational thinking, if I were to take it as meaning largely scientific thinking, being able to analyze critically problems and break them down into pieces that I can actually tackle, coding is one of the best ways of crystallizing such thinking, because computers do not speak English, right? And you cannot be ambiguous simply because every word in a computer programming language is translated into actual mechanical or electronic motion onto the machine. Okay? So you can't get it wrong, no ambiguity whatsoever. So if you are going to be able to actually appreciate the difficulty of a problem and realize it in the form of code that works, you have pretty much understood the step-by-step deduction of the solution towards the solution. So I can see that, right? But my argument that didn't end up very well for myself is that computational thinking is not computer programming. It's more than that. So at that time, I think that, just like you said, coding is being popularized. The university wanted to do coding as computational thinking. I said, no way. I ended up having to teach a course of 5 years to walk the talk.
Yeah. But now, with ChatGPT, I mean, how can we prepare the educator for that?
I don't know. This is, I largely think that this is not a matter of a technical training, right? Now, you can, in principle, take advantage of ChatGPT without having the knowledge of the speakers, two speakers that we, into the background details. But you probably will have to be sensitive to some of these user experiences from the more, those people, those who come before you in experimenting with some of these users, and what are the shortcomings and concerns that you might have to bear in mind. And I think that anyone who's interested, if you are a teacher, you have a very specific goal ahead of you. I want to help my students to do this. They can easily, just in time learning, you can pick it up from anywhere you like. Of course, having said that, putting someone through a structured, training in a day or two has its advantages. Makes you cannot say, oh, I don't understand this step, I go tomorrow, search the net again.
Thank you. Anyone, any other questions for Prof. Lai? No, okay, thanks, Prof. Lai again. Thank you. We are having a round table. Okay, may I have the three speakers please come on stage? Okay, I think let me start off with a recent news that related to education. Actually, just now when they were here, I did mention something. In recently, there is a case actually over in U.S., Texas A&M University. A professor flunked all his students because ChatGPT said that the work by the students are all written by ChatGPT. Now, having said that, of course, I mean, that creates a lot of issues. That means educators are also using ChatGPT, but whether they are using it correctly or not is another question. That's also one of the reasons why I asked Prof. Lai at the end, and how we can prepare educators to deal with such a fast-moving and evolving era. So maybe I want to hear because all of them are involved in education sector, then what's the think about how we should deal with it?
Okay. Prof, I really liked your point about all these uses of ChatGPT make my life easier, but don't necessarily make me a better teacher. So convenience is the worst drug there is. Looking for the shortcut, trying to find the easy answer. And so I think, the professor was looking for an easy way to determine how this new technology was being used by his students, and he got caught out in that. So I think that's, the problem is this technology is so easy to use. It's so convenient to use. But yeah.
Yeah, so when I saw that piece, I was wondering that the professor wasn't aware that generally language models, they can't explain their own behavior. But this is something that I guess people will get to know. It's like when web search engines first came about, most people didn't know how to use it. Nowadays there's enough knowledge, general knowledge about web search engines that most people know the general basics. So I think language models, maybe another 2, 3, 5 years, it will become more and more common about knowledge about some of these weaknesses and strengths. Yeah.
Actually, I wonder, is it possible for us to input a paragraph into ChatGPT and see, have you seen this somewhere before?
I mean, I've read studies where they try to determine, they take a piece of text, they remove the noun, and see whether they can guess correctly the noun. Because there's no way you can guess the noun without actually seeing the text. So there have been studies like that prove that a lot of Harry Potter is inside, a lot of science fiction and fantasy is inside for some reason. So I've seen a lot of studies on that, yeah.
No, it's a huge issue, right? How do you have 70 billion parameters and 1.4 trillion tokens that you've trained on. So the statistical model that relates all these things is super complicated, right? I mean, you have to tell us how complexity theory is gonna help us figure out how to pull things out. So yeah, this explainability issue seems to me a very serious one. I think what I'm more worried about is accountability, though, because what I fear is that we're getting one answer surfaced out of a soup. And I mean, Aaron's presentation was made me so happy because I could see the technology being used to identify the sources of information more precisely, right, and helping us find those sources of information. But I worry that that's not the main use case, right? That the main use case is, I want a quick answer. And so, to me, if all of the value of creating knowledge and creating these answers that authors and publishers and librarians have worked together to create a system for this, if all that system is collapsed into one window where you're looking for the answer, this is a big loss of value, and the skepticism that we have about truth claims is just going to get worse. I mean, yes, subjectivity, contestation, but in fact we have systems of contesting and getting a relative strength of search claims, and so of truth claims. And so my fear is that this technology really, my resistance to the technology is only in this problem.
Okay, and another question. Actually, recently I read I listened to Bill Gates, one of the talk on Confuse Me with Bill Gates. He asked, can AI help to close the education gap? Now, with this, what do you think?
Well, I think that to the extent that this is a technology which necessarily imply that, there's got to be a certain level of infrastructure being at its back, right? I mean, in this case, ChatGPT, for example, minimally, you do need internet connection, and you do need to probably at this point in time proficient in English language, etc., to be able to make you take advantage of it. And I'm not sure this is going to bridge the gap, the educational gap, considering the fact that the whole world is not necessarily at the same stage of development, definitely overall, and definitely not in terms of technological infrastructure that are put in place. I don't know. I mean, not in terms of, at least in the context of this generative AI in the form of ChatGPT is being realized. I personally don't see it as, in fact, I think this is one of the worries that I've listed, access is going to pull many of the communities even further in terms of being able to take advantage of this new technology in education.
It's more on accessibility, one of the key issues, right? How about the others? Any
I mean,
any
about
thoughts on that?
equity, one of the questions, I got pushback because I was telling librarians that we should pay more to make papers open access so that they can be read by machines. The pushback I got from some librarians is that the people who are going to benefit from such things will be Google, large companies, right? Small universities and normal people wouldn't actually benefit from open access. We are basically giving data to only the big companies that can produce such large language models. Right, so there's been pushback to say that we should pay more to make things open access just for them. Yeah.
You know, one of the reasons that we think this could be useful there are all kinds of gaps that the technology is always, every time a new technology comes in, it's going to solve the big problems that we haven't been able to solve for such a long time. One of the things that's interesting about the AI technology is the idea of personalizing education, right? So the AI can enable you to get the content that you want that matches your learning style. But I've always had a question mark in my mind, right? Let's say we have a textbook, and that textbook is going to suit some students. They're going to, really learn from that textbook easily, but other students who have different learning predispositions will not be useful. So of course we have, let's say there are 4 different kinds of learners, right? That's one of the models out there, 4 different learning styles. So textbook is good for one. All right, so we're going to create tools that are going to be good for all 4 types. So basically we're going to have to come up with videos, say, if you're an audio-visual learner, to reproduce the same content. So in order to meet this goal of offering content in the form that is suitable for your learning style, we have to multiply the content by 4. Now, can AI do that? Well, it probably can help, but at the same time, we're eroding the economic basis for creating the content. Who's going to create all the extra content? Right now, the burden is on the teacher. You have these resources, you have to cater for all the different learning styles in your classroom, go for it. Now you have to do 4 times the work that you used to do last time. There's not more money for textbook publishers to create 4 different channels of learning. There's less money there. So I think this is one, aside from the access and equity problems, I think there is also this problem that somehow we're going to magically create all of this wonderful content to be able to suit all the different learning styles in a glorious future personalized learning that Bill Gates is, always talking about.
Yeah, okay, but one thing, for example, now talk about that, because now I remember before search engine come in, then we go to library to look for information. Actually, our learning process actually take much a longer time. Now with search engine comes in, and then we do things much faster. So what do you think? Will this new thing will help people to learn faster, or what? Because now you do a search engine, you need to read through all these links and then to understand. Now,
Well,
they summarize.
I'm sure that human brains are evolving, right? Getting better and better, right? But I'm not sure that the speedy availability of information is necessarily a better way of quote-unquote learning, right? Because I think that building up, to me, I think knowledge is being built, right? Is cumulative, and most importantly, it is something that information or that you can gather either from the textbook or from the internet has to be internalized. Your own organization in your brain as to where this information should be fitting and how it relates to some of the other information that you have learned or gathered earlier on. And that process, I don't know necessarily being shortened by the same factor as at the rate at which information is available at this point in time. As a matter of fact, I think the speedy availability of information has even sort of softened this need to internalize the information.
Yeah, I fully agree. So knowledge is about constructing models and to really understand the data. So the faster you can get the information, the more easy you can fool yourself into thinking that you actually have knowledge of the area. So Google already made people think they're experts because they can Google and straight away read off the answer. ChatGPT is going to make it worse. Everybody will think they're experts on every subject just by asking the question from ChatGPT. Yeah.
I like the characterization of ChatGPT. Sorry, this is an all-male panel. I just wanted to point that out. So I like the characterization of ChatGPT as the ultimate mansplainer. Whether it knows the truth or not, it says it with perfect and total confidence.
Yeah, actually, I asked this question because I agree with you all, but I get the impression someone think that, yes, now the information is so readily available, and then the curriculum will speed up, everything will speed up, and then are we learning? That is an
All of us are
very
in
important.
for the information business. We're not going to say that having more access to information more easily is a bad thing.
Well, I used to say to my students, all right, almost nothing that you learn at the university will ever be used in exactly the same form as being taught to you, okay? I can almost guarantee that, right? So how are you going to be able to sort of exercise, quote unquote, the knowledge that you have gained when you're in the university? If you do not internalize it, it becomes part of you, right? It underlies the way that your neurons are actually firing whenever you are presented with a certain stimulus, right? And I think that doesn't come, at light speed as information.
Very good. Actually, I also have that understanding. I mean, with the newest technology, I think make things so fast, and then we are so easily available to get the answer. But in terms of education, I think it's a totally different things. And sometimes making mistakes is the best way to learn something, and you solve it. Yeah. So. Okay, please.
So Aaron, I really enjoyed your presentation. I learned so much. I wonder, I have this ambivalent relationship with bibliometrics because I publish in social science and humanities mostly, and we don't perform very well on the bibliometrics. Historians don't cite each other as often as psychologists. They cite historical sources, right? Original primary sources. So I'm a little skeptical of it. I noticed that in the questions you asked, there was a tendency naturally that the most highly cited sources came up to the top. But you asked about the open access advantage. Those sources were all from 2005, 2007, 2008, presumably because they have more citations. So I also worry a little bit, especially in emerging fields, in new areas, publishing and coming up with content and ideas that are generated outside the traditional centers. Are we kind of making the hierarchy of knowledge a little bit more rigid by relying on the bibliometrics to generate? I mean, even it's so much better than just relying on the mysteries of ChatGPT, but still, I do wonder if there's structural problems there. What do you think?
Bibliometrics is a whole different area, and of course, basing research assessment just on bibliometrics is a huge issue. In terms of language models, you're right. I think research is trying to emerging that ChatGPT loves to cite, top cited journals and things like that. So the same effect is probably occurring whether using a search engine like Google Scholar, which has a bias towards highly cited papers, as well as using language models. Basically, the more the language model sees a paper, the more likely it's going to cite it, mention it, right? So the same effect will probably occur. Yeah.
Okay, I think any other question for our panel here? If no, let's thank our panel again. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.